Good afternoon, producer Susan. Staying warm?
Oh, a little bit too warm for me, and it's only going to get worse this week.
And how's your humidity?
Pretty miserable. It's oppressive.
Well, you asked me to talk about dew points and relative humidity, so that's going to be one of our topics today. So let me give you the rundown of what I'm going to try to squeeze in today. Anyway, today's July 25th, last week of July. It's the situation with Jerzee Joe. It's news and perspective you won't hear on TV. Our quote of the week is from the late economist Friedrich Hayek. Ever heard of Friedrich Hayek? Hayek?
I have not.
He's a very famous economist and political philosopher. I think he passed away in 1992, but he's written several books. He's considered kind of a guru on economics. So we'll talk about a quote from him. And again, our science segment, you suggested that it's this hot and humid time of year that we talk about things like relative humidity, dew point, and what is wet bulb versus dry bulb. We'll also tell you about a related term you may not have heard before. It's something called transpiration, but it's relative. And we'll also tell you why the recent hot weather in Phoenix is not, quote, record-setting as being reported. We'll also tell you about the shocking increase in the number of auto thefts in this country, and the figures might both surprise and concern you. We'll tell you why the solution to this country's power generation and distribution issue might be a nuclear reactor that can be installed in your garage or basement. How'd you like to have a nuclear reactor in your basement?
If it can save me money, yeah, I'd be in favor of it.
All right, we'll tell you all about that. We'll tell you about a new rule by the Biden administration that will outlaw the sale of all current portable gas generators that are currently on the market before this time next year. You know anybody uses a portable generator?
A lot, and I think they're really vital to people who live in hurricane territory and tornado territory.
Right. And if you're a farmer, you have a remote well, or if you're building construction, we'll talk about all the places that portable generators are used and why outlawing them, I think by February of next year is going to create all sorts of problems for people. You ever heard of the Tuskegee Airmen?
I have.
The World War II all African American fighter pilot squadron?
Hmm.
You ever heard of the Black Panthers?
I have.
Also known as Patton's Panthers?
I've never heard them called Patton's Panthers.
But you've heard of the Black Panthers, right?
Yes. Hmm.
Well, we'll tell you about who the Black Panthers were in World War II. They were the land-based equivalent of the Tuskegee Airmen. And our taxpayer relief shot is from North Carolina, where a man is awakened in the middle of the night, and he's got a little storage unit out in his backyard, and he goes out in his backyard to see who the hell's breaking into his storage unit in the middle of the night, and the guy attacks him. And as you can guess, it did not work out for the guy trying to break into his storage unit in the middle of the night. So, but that we might be able to fit all that in. Anyway.
I feel like that's a light week in comparison to some of the
It is,
topics we
but
have.
we're going to spend quite a bit of time on the science segment because the dew point relative humidity is not something I can cover in 60 seconds. Anyway, here's the quote of the week from Friedrich. By the way, it's not Frederick, it's Friedrich Hayek, and it's spelled Hayek. And if you want to Google his name and just a bunch of quotes, and he's written some great books, but here's one of his quotes, and here's his quote. There is all the difference in the world between treating people equally and attempting to make them equal. While the first is a condition of a free society, the second means, as described by Alexander de Tocqueville, a new form of servitude. You need me to read that again, or did you get it the first time?
No, I got it the first time, and I agree. I agree with that. They're not the same, and people need to understand that.
Right. Trying to make everybody equal basically is servitude. Okay, you can't succeed. We're going to make you identical to everybody else. You're all going to live in the same house. You're all going to have the same income. That's servitude. So again, for those who didn't catch it the first time, and by the way, he quotes Alexander de Tocqueville. Do you know who he was?
No.
French philosopher about the time of the U.S. America declared its independence from England. So de Tocqueville wrote quite a bit about the American independence movement, but he was a philosopher and political observer, Alexander de Tocqueville. So anyway, so Here's that quote again, and I'll leave out de Tocqueville's name just to make comprehension easier. Hayek said, there is all the difference in the world between treating people equally and attempting to make them equal. While the first is a condition of a free society, the second is a new form of servitude. And I couldn't agree more. Once you try to make everybody equal, you have to put constraints on those who would excel and rise above. So I think that's a great quote, and it really points out the difference between capitalism and socialism and a merit-based society. All right, so you want to know about dew point, relative humidity, dry bulb, wet bulb. So let's talk about the easy one first. And I know you're an earth science major, so you may know a lot of this stuff, but a lot of our listeners may not. So relative humidity, what does that mean? Well, it describes how much moisture is in a cubic foot of air compared to how much moisture that cubic foot of air can hold at a given temperature. So, and by the way, and warm air can hold more moisture than cold air. So you might wake up in the morning and they may say, right now at 7 a.m., the relative humidity is 72%. Well, as the air warms up, even though there's no change in the amount of moisture in the air, if the amount of moisture in the air stays the same, as the air gets warmer, that relative humidity will drop from 72% to 52% because the warmer air in the afternoon can hold more moisture. So let's say there were 12 grams of water in that cubic foot of air at 7 o'clock in the morning, and that was 72% of what that cubic foot of air could hold. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that same cubic foot of air might be able to hold 25 grams of moisture. So even though the amount of moisture, in this case 12 grams in that cubic foot, hasn't changed because the air is hotter, the relative humidity, in other words, how much can it hold, has gone down, even though the amount of moisture hasn't changed. So let's talk about, by the way, any questions before I move on from there?
Not for me, but I understand this stuff.
All right, so let's talk about dew point. So let's go back to 7 o'clock in the morning when it's 72% relative humidity at 70 degrees. Well, if that temperature, if we were to get a cold front, or let's say it's evening time, and let's say at 7 o'clock at night, it's 70 degrees outside and the relative humidity is 72%. As the sun goes down and the temperature starts to cool, the dew point is that point as the air cools where that air can no longer contain that 12 grams of moisture, and it starts to condense out on the leaves, as we call it dew. You get dew on the grass, dew on the leaves. That is the moisture that was being held in that 70-degree air condensing out onto leaves and grass, because at 55 degrees at night, when that 70-degree air cools down to 55, that 55-degree air can no longer hold all of that moisture, so it condenses out, and that's what we call the dew point. Now, when the relative humidity reaches 100%, you get two things typically happen. One is fog, right? Fog is when the air says, I give up, here's your moisture back. The other is rain. When the temperature, when you get a cold front moves through and that cold front cools the air says, I give up, I can't hold this water, here, you can have it back, and you get rain. All right? So now how do we measure those things? You ever heard the weatherman talk about the dry bulb, wet bulb?
Yep.
All right, so we all know what a dry bulb is. You look out in your deck, the thermometer, boom, and there's the temperature. But when the air is not at 100% relative humidity, when water evaporates, it cools things off. So, and let me give you an example. So when you go to the doctor to either give blood or he's going to give you an inoculation, they put alcohol on your arm. And when they take the cotton ball away, your arm feels cool. Well, it's not because the alcohol was cold, it's because the alcohol is evaporating. When a liquid evaporates, goes from liquid to gas, it requires the addition of heat. So for that alcohol to evaporate off your arm, it has to draw heat from somewhere, and it draws heat from your arm. Here's a better example. Let's say you're in Phoenix, and it's 100 degrees, and you get up now, your body temperature, normal body temperature is what?
98.6.
All right, so you get out of a pool in Phoenix, you're soaking wet, air temperature is 100, but there's a stiff breeze blowing, and all of a sudden you get a chill, you get goosebumps. Well, how can 100-degree breeze, if it's warmer than your body temperature, how can 100-degree breeze cool you off and give you a chill?
That's the wet bulb effect.
Right. That's the water from the pool that's on your skin evaporating into that dry air. So as that water on your skin evaporates, it's sucking heat out of your skin. And that's why you can get goosebumps on a 100-degree day in Phoenix if you're soaking wet on a dry day. So here's how they actually, and so the difference between those two, and by the way, and when the dry bulb and the wet bulb are the same, it's 100% relative humidity. But let's say it's not 100%. What they literally do is they take a thermometer and they wrap a little piece of cloth or cotton around the base of the thermometer and they wet it with water.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have this thing with a string on it. It's called a sling psychrometer. And they literally whip that thermometer around with the wet cloth on the end of the bulb, and they whip it around for 20 seconds. And at the end of the 20 seconds, they read the temperature. Now, if it's not 100% relative humidity, the temperature on that thermometer that had the wet piece of cotton on the bottom will be cooler
Mm-hmm.
than so let's say you're in your living room and the living room thermometer dry bulb says, hey, it's 72 in here, and it's dry, you've got the air conditioning on, it's 72, but it's low humidity in your living room. When you whip that thermometer with the wet piece of cotton around, that wet bulb temperature in your living room might say 64. Well, how did it get to be 64 if the temperature is 72? The answer is the water, as it evaporated off that wet piece of cotton, cooled the thermometer, and that's where you get the wet bulb temperature. Now, since that evaporation is only enabled by the ability of that water to evaporate, as the humidity approaches 100%, what happens to the ability of liquids to evaporate as the humidity approaches 100%?
They just form moisture.
I'm sorry?
They can't evaporate, they form moisture.
Right, you can't evaporate water into 100%. So the higher the humidity, the closer that the dry bulb and wet bulb will be. And once you get to 100% relative humidity, you can whip that thermometer with the wet piece of cotton around all day long. It's not going to be any difference because there'll be no evaporation because, again, wet bulb is only lower than dry bulb when the water is able to evaporate. And when the water can't evaporate, that means it's 100% relative humidity. So that's the difference between wet bulb and dry bulb. So any questions or anything you want to add, since you're an earth science major, to wet bulb and dry bulb and relative humidity?
Nope, but those of you living in the Northeast this week are going to experience some hazy, hot, and humid, muggy temperatures later this week.
All right. Now, if we have any farmers, ever heard the word transpiration?
I have not heard that term before.
Well, let me ask you, it's transpiration is a fancy word for plant sweat. So here, let me put this in perspective. So when you have a plant and the leaf on the plant withers and becomes brittle, what happened to the moisture that was in the leaf?
It has evaporated.
It evaporated, right. It didn't go back down to the roots. It literally evaporated and the plant leaf dried out. Well, that's something that happens for a living plant. That's something that it happens continually. That's how a plant, particularly in warm weather, keeps itself cool, because we just talked about how evaporation cools whatever. It'll cool your skin. It'll cool the thermometer. If a plant leaf which has liquid water, gives up that liquid water in the form of gaseous water, that transition from liquid water to gaseous water cools the leaf. And let me tell you how extreme this is. Now, 1 acre of corn. Now, an acre, for those who don't have a good visualization, an acre is only about 200 feet by 200 feet. It's like 2/3 of a football field. It's 200 feet long, 200 feet wide. That's an acre. You want to guess how much water an acre of corn will transpire? I mean, in other words, give off in a day?
Oh, I'm guessing probably a couple gallons.
Try 4,000 gallons of water a day. 4,000 gallons. 1 cubic yard, 3 feet by 3 feet of corn gives off a gallon. So a 3 feet by 3 feet of corn will give off 1 gallon per day. Now, if you know anything about corn, you know a corn plant can be 8 feet tall, and it's got these big broad leaves, and those broad leaves occur 3 or 4, even sometimes 5 places on that stalk as the stalk goes up in the air. And each one of those leaves, has a lot of surface area. So an acre of corn will transpire 4,000 gallons of water in a day. How's that?
That's a lot of water.
That's a lot of water. So let's move on to Phoenix. Have you heard any local weather guys saying Phoenix is experiencing a record heat wave?
Yeah, I feel like that's a common trend to hear on the evening news weather.
Now, you notice that they're not saying record temperatures. They're saying heat wave, meaning prolonged period of heat. So we're not talking about, how hot is the hottest temperature. They're simply saying so many days. Well, the one I saw, Phoenix has had more than 50 days of daily temperatures in excess of 100 degrees so far this summer. Well, is that a heat wave? Now, do you know what the NOAA is?
Yes, it's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association.
So, right, the federal government. That's the official record-keeping people. So, is more than 50 days of daily temperature in excess of 100 degrees, is that a record for Phoenix? Well, if we look at that Phoenix data, since 1905, they have records going back to 1905, which is 118 years. Right now, well, first of all, Phoenix there's not been a single year where Phoenix hasn't had some days above 100. More than a dozen for the past. So where does the current run of 58 days above 100 for 2023 currently sit relative to those 118 other years? You want to guess where those 58 days?
Probably. I feel like that might be average.
Well, I'm just saying that if we look at the full year, now the summer's not over yet, but if we just say, hey, if it stopped tomorrow, where would those 58 days put it out of those 118 years? What place would those 58 days put it?
I think it would be pretty average. I'm thinking, June and July, August are the hottest months of the year, and we're at the end of July. So that's 60 days of, yeah, I think that's average.
Well, yeah. And right now, by the way, if it stopped and there were no more 100 days, it would come in at 112th place out of 118, not even in the top 50%. Now, it's true, summer's not over. But even if the daily temperature in Phoenix went above 100 every day for the remainder of July, we have 6 days left in July, and there's 31 days in August, which is 47 additional days, for a total of 104 days with temperatures above 100. Where would that place 2023 on the list? It would be tied for 47th place with 3 other years that also had 104 days of temperatures in excess of 100. And what were some of the other years that would place above 2023 on that list? How about 1910, when Phoenix had 121 days of temperatures above 100? 121 days of temperatures above 100 degrees in 1910s. How many cars were on the road back in 1910?
None.
How many coal-fired central power plants do you think there were in the United States in 1910?
None.
So here we have 1910, when there were no coal-fired power plants. We didn't have 13 million. I'm sorry, we didn't have 130 million vehicles on the road. China, there were not just in the United States. We didn't have cars in Europe. We didn't have cars in China. We didn't have cars in India. Yet 1910, we had 121 days of above 100. Now, I said if Phoenix continued to have days above 100 for every day between now and the end of August, they would come in at 47th place. But how likely is that to actually happen? Are you familiar with the monsoon rainy season?
Yes.
Well, guess what? You know what? Phoenix has just entered their annual monsoon rainy season.
August. Yep.
Right. So is it likely that every day in August is going to be 100 degrees in Phoenix?
Probably not, because the rain's going to cool. As we just talked about wet bulb, the rain's going to cool.
Right. And the clouds and the clouds are going to impede the radiant warming of the sun. So unless there's no rain in Phoenix this year, Phoenix is going to, as you said, it's probably going to be a pretty average year for Phoenix. So anyway, so if anybody wants, we can, producer Susan can put this NOAA record data in the show notes. So if you have a weatherman, your local weatherman saying it's a record-setting heat wave in Phoenix, you ought to send him this NOAA data that shows no, it isn't. All right. How's any car theft news out by where you live?
We're fortunate, and not a lot of car thefts, although in some particular neighborhoods, catalytic converters are the hot ticket item.
Yeah, that's everywhere. Well, in addition to catalytic converters, since 2019, since the first 6 months of 2019, if you compare the number of car thefts, cars stolen in the first 6 months of 2023 to 2019, what do you think the increase has been in percentage basis?
From what year?
2019, first 6 months of 19 to the first 6 months of 23.
I think it was pretty high, because I think there's a couple of car companies out there that had a flaw in their ignition key fob.
Well, that made it easier, but again, just because it's easier to steal something, I know a lot of politicians are trying to hang that on that, but the data really doesn't support it, because the increase has been 104%. And just because it's easier to steal a Hyundai or a Kia doesn't account for literally a more than doubling of the number of car thefts. In fact, since last year to this year, and last year, by the way, those same cars with that same ignition flaw were on the road last year, the increase from just last year to this year is 34%. So that would kind of shoot holes in the fact, well, it's because of these cars you usually steal. Well, they were just as easy to steal last year as they are this year. So that doesn't explain why there's been a 34% increase.
I feel like not just cars. I feel like just crime in general is up across the nation. I don't know if it was the pandemic or the economy or what is going on with our world today, but crime.
Well, in a lot of places like Denver, they've actually made it no longer a felony to steal a car. And in particular, what the car thieves are doing now, they now know if you're a minor under 18, they're not going to prosecute you as a felon. So what they're doing now is they're sending they're literally recruiting the 16 and 17-year-old kids to go out and steal the cars. And in fact, didn't we have a taxpayer relief shot about 4 or 5 months ago where 12-year-old kids stole a car and died?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're literally recruiting. So a lot of it has to do, not all of it, but I think a lot of it has to do with our criminal justice system, where politicians are saying, yeah, we don't think, if you're 16 years old and steal a car, we don't think you should have a felony on your record. Well, the thieves have jumped all over that, and it's become a lucrative business for kids stealing cars now. I mean, they're literally part of organized rings because they know, yeah, even if I get caught, I basically get the equivalent of a ticket. I'll be brought in, I'll be booked, I'll be handed an appearance ticket, and I won't even spend the night in jail. I can steal a car and I won't even spend the night in jail. So when you look at risk reward, the reward is because you're going to take that car to a chop shop and they're going to hand you $1,000 in cash. So the risk is, if I can steal 4 cars in a night at $1,000 a piece, and even if I get caught, I'm going to be handed a ticket and a notice to appear. Wouldn't you continue to steal cars?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all right.
And I think this goes back to some other conversations we've had in past shows about the family dynamics and dads in the house. There was a coworker of mine, his teenage son got into mischief with his car, and the police were called, and it wasn't theft or anything, but teenage mischief, wholesome teenage mischief, if there is such a thing. And the dad's response was, how can we scare the bejesus out of my son? Because the dad wants to teach the son a lesson. And I think that this is what we're missing in America today.
Yep. And by the way, when I was a teenager, and I've talked about this because every teenager, up in upstate New York, every teenager had access to a loaded rifle. After dinner, we'd go shooting. There wasn't a single teenager that didn't have access to a loaded rifle, yet we didn't have school shootings. Well, what was different then? Well, number one, they all had fathers, and 2, you'd see every one of them in church on Sunday morning. Today,
and this is a church-going family, and dad is in the household, and the dad's first response is to the cop is, how can you scare the bejesus out of my son so we can teach him a lesson?
Yep. So again, fathers are important, and having some moral compass is important too. And unfortunately, we have too many kids today growing up with no father in the home. And I know church attendance by teenagers has fallen off. I think it's down in the 20% range these days. So it's just really, really sad.
And this is a generation too. You said no fathers in the home. This is a generation too where there's oftentimes not even mothers in the home, where the child is being raised by grandparents or other
Yes.
family members.
And that's unfortunately very, very true. Yeah, and in the worst cases, the mother is, a crack addict or something, and she's either in jail or she's in rehab somewhere. So yes, grandma is raising the kid, no father, no mother. It's so sad. All right. You want to add anything more, or should we move on to the
No,
next?
we can move on to next topic. You got about 10 minutes left.
All right. Well, there's all the problem about, about the grid, and the grid is being electrical district being stressed, and, it's
Yeah.
at its breaking point. Well, currently, due to losses at the generating plant, only 55% of the energy in a cubic foot of natural gas or pound of coal actually makes it to the wall socket in your home. The rest is given off as either waste heat at the waste heat in the plant, it's called stack losses, or by the power transmission lines themselves, electrical substation, and even the transformers on their pole. And here we are talking about we want to add electric vehicles. We want to replace gas stoves with electric stoves. We want to replace gas water heaters with electric water heaters. The grid cannot handle that much additional electrical demand. We've talked about this, and it would cost trillions of dollars in decades to upgrade, all of those transmission lines to carry that heat. So even if you blanketed the United States with wind turbines and solar farms, we don't have the transmission, the grid to distribute that power. And again, it's a shame. And even with a wind turbine or solar, you're still losing power to the line. It's called line losses. Every wire has resistance, and the resistance in the wire generates heat, and that's wasted energy being given off to the atmosphere. So imagine if you had a little mini nuclear power plant in your home, or maybe for your community. That way you wouldn't have to rely on high tension lines that are going hundreds of miles. In fact, even when you have a power plant in the middle of a state, if you've got 60 miles of transmission lines going east, and 60 miles going north, and 70 miles going south, you've got several hundred miles of high tension transmission lines. Well, imagine if you had a nuclear power plant in your basement, or you had one in your neighborhood. That would do away, number one, we wouldn't have to upgrade the grid, and two, we wouldn't be wasting all that energy to line losses, because that electricity wouldn't have to travel. Well, people said, yeah, that's a nice dream. Well, guess what? It's not a dream. NASA has developed a nuclear reactor the size of a roll of a paper towel roll. Literally, it's as big as a roll of paper towels. Now, to shield it and have all the safety and radiation protection, they encase it in a container about the size of a trash can. But it's a real thing. They're going to put these on spacecraft, like for the Mars rover. So when they're putting these, when they want to send a spacecraft to Mars, it's going to be powered by a nuclear reactor the size of a garbage can. So that technology is real. It's here now. Is it going to be in your house next week? No, but in 20 years, I don't see why not. And
yeah, so I mean that I feel like that's a reasonable size to have in your basement or garage or whatever. So yeah, I guess my question is of like, is it, cost effective? Obviously for things like the space shuttle, that's expensive, but for the average homeowner, is this going to be realistic?
No, it may not be, but that's where, by the way, every town, I'm sure, do you know where the substation is in your town?
I do. Yes.
Yeah. And every town has one, it's where the 50,000 volt electricity that's coming through those high voltage transmission lines is dropped down into a little area of cyclone fences, maybe, 100 feet by 100 feet. And you're looking, you've got all these transformers. That's where that 50,000 volt electricity from the high voltage transmission lines is stepped down to something more usable, like 460 volt, and then redistributed to your neighborhood. Well, imagine instead of that substation, you had a tractor trailer sized nuclear power plant for the neighborhood, which could be maintained and monitored and would supply power. Again, you are no longer dependent upon a central power plant, and you no longer need cross country high voltage transmission lines. So
we have a phenomenon that happens in my neighborhood. This happens at least once a week in the summertime, if not twice a week. I lose power at least once a week in the summertime. And now it only goes off for a minute. But do you know why? I live in a very suburban neighborhood. Do you know why my power goes off at least once a week every morning?
I have no clue. I have absolutely no clue. But you could actually call and ask, by the way.
Well, I think it's the squirrels. I think it's the squirrels playing
Right.
with I think the reason why this may not happen in the winter is because there's the leaves are not touching the power lines, and the squirrels are, because like a bird, a squirrel can sit on a power line.
Sure.
But I think it has to do with the greenery that might also be touching the power line, and the squirrels are getting electrocuted.
It could
Because
be.
we lose power just for it's a bump, and it happens at least once a week, if not twice a week. And it only happens in the June and July.
When wildlife is at its most active. All right. By the way, I've just made an executive decision. We're not going to have time to get to the taxpayer relief shout. I want to do two things though. Consumer protection state. Here's where the executive branch can bypass Congress. The Consumer Protection Safety Council, CPSC, you've heard of them, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They've announced new, quote, safety reg. These are the people that, ban child car seats for not being safe. They've determined that, quote, portable gas generators emit unhealthy levels of carbon monoxide and represent a danger to the public. So they're going to ban their sale by February 1st of next year. Now, let's talk about where portable gas generators are used and how essential they are. During the early phases of new home construction, when there is no electricity, because all you have is an empty lot in the middle of a field, portable generators provide the power for the saws, the lights, the cooling fans, and the air compressors that power all the nail guns. During the winter months, they also provide the power to the torpedo-style space heaters that keep the workers warm. On commercial steel building sites, they provide the power to the welding machines. On a farm, they provide the power, particularly out in the West. What they do is they'll drill a well out in the middle of a field, but you're a mile from the nearest telephone pole. And what they do is they'll run out there with a flatbed truck, and they'll hook up the generator on the back of the flatbed truck to the pump, and they'll pump up a 500-gallon tank full of water using the portable generator to power the well pump, and then they'll disconnect and leave. And 2 days later, they'll come back and do the same thing again. If you've got a portable hay elevator at a barn in the middle of a hayfield, you'll power that hay elevator with a portable generator. You also use it to power welding machines to repair farm machinery. If you break down a piece of machinery in the middle of a farm and you can't bring it back because maybe the hitch is broke in the middle of a field, you bring the welding machine to the machinery in the middle of the field and you weld it in the field. So that's where they're used. Anyway, so the Biden administration has decided that, they're not saying that you can't ever have them. They're just saying none of the ones currently being made meet our standards. So all of you guys who are making them, in 6 months, you have to come up with a whole next generation of portable generators. Well, guess what? You cannot design, test, tool up, and produce a next generation of portable welding machines in 6 months. Not possible. Did we just run out of time? No, we've got time to go.
No, but there must have been a bad connection for a minute there.
All right. Anyway,
I think for our average listener, though, we talked about tornadoes and hurricanes, but in winter snowstorms, when people lose electricity, I can't tell you how many of my friends and family have these portable generators just to get through a horrific storm. That is pretty common.
And if you go camping, a lot of these people who want to go camping where there's not a hookup, they have a portable generator to power their campsite. Anyway, before we run out of time, I don't want to give this short shrift. The Black Panthers, also known as Patton's Panthers after General George Patton. In World War II, the 761st Tank Battalion was staffed and manned entirely by African-American soldiers, and they were a fierce force. Now, we've all heard about the Tuskegee Airmen. Well, the Black Panthers were the tank battalion equivalent of the Tuskegee Airmen. What's interesting, in August on the History Channel, Morgan Freeman is going to narrate a special on the 761st Tank Battalion. So if you're interested in learning about the Black Panthers, don't miss the Morgan Freeman special on the Black Panthers.
And what day and time was that again?
I don't know the exact day. I know it's in August, but just check the History Channel.
Yeah.
Black Panthers. How much time do we have?
You have about 3 minutes.
All right, let me just play the North Carolina taxpayer relief shot without any intro. Again, guy wakes up in the middle of the night, goes out, confronts a guy in the middle of his yard who attacks him. It's a really quick one. Here we go.
In Salem, a man is dead after he was shot while breaking into a storage building. Police say early this morning, 2 people woke up to Christopher Paish breaking into the building at their home on White Rock Road. We're told one of them confronted the man and during that confrontation fired a gun. Paish was hit and later died. Police say the homeowners will not be charged in this case.
So dead right there, and the homeowners will not be charged. There's a longer version I didn't play where he confronted the guy and then the guy attacked them. But again, a classic taxpayer relief shot.
Classic self-defense.
Self-defense, homeowners not charged. Anyway, we're running out of time, so I want to thank producer Susan. Anything you want to add?
No, stay cool this week. The temperatures are going to be deadly this week on the Northeast.
All right. Well, stay cool. Watch that wet bulb, and I'll talk to you next week. Take
All
care.
right.
All right. Bye-bye, Sue. Here we go, and we are done.